I'm Peter Carter with a Climate Emergency Institute video and bringing you the latest terrible news of global climate change situation. Firstly, I would really like to thank all of my virtual supporters on Facebook and Twitter. I'm really grateful for you to be looking at them and passing them on, etc. The International Energy Agency just released the latest figures for global energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. This is another record. 2022 was yet again a record for CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels and from industry. It reached the level of 36.8 gigatons, 36.8 billion tons more CO2 gone up into the atmosphere, the air and atmosphere, over the past year. And CO2, of course, is the main greenhouse gas causing global heating. And also, I want to remind you, the sole greenhouse gas causing ocean acidification. Again, I want to repeat that the climate change indicators that I monitor are also at an all-time high, and they're increasing at an all-time high rate. And this will continue so long, of course, as these CO2 emissions continue to increase, let alone not stop and decrease. But it was really bad because coal emissions from burning coal, the very worst, they were at an all-time high. All of the sources of CO2 emissions increased in the past year: coal, oil, and gas. Coal grew last year by 1.6%, and that's a record rate of growth for coal, which again is at a record high, and it exceeds the last 10 years average rate of coal emissions by a large margin. And coal has reached 15.5 gigatons or a billion tons of emissions. Oil, however, as you'll probably know, the fossil fuel corporations have made what is called a windfall record profit. I would call it a killing profit. But oil last year, CO2 emissions rose more than coal, even 2.5% in 1 year. And that's phenomenally, absolutely terrible. Now, I want to talk about another vividly, horribly, dramatically terrible news. And that, of course, is the continuing bloody war in Ukraine. Why am I bringing up the Ukraine war again? Well, because it's absolutely critical. It's critical on not only the survival of the people in Ukraine, but survival of all of us, for the survival of the entire world. This, of course, is recognized as a horrible proxy war between the United States and NATO, of course, and the Russian Federation. Has been going on for a year now, and it's getting more and more destructive, more and more bloodier, horrible street fighting and trench warfare with heavy artillery. It is a bloody business. And of course, I mentioned business, the arms industries, particularly in the United States, are making record profits right now. So this is a terrible, horrible, destructive, bloody war. But I have to get back to its significance to my subject, which of course is global climate change. It's now 30 years since the 1992 UN Climate Convention was signed by all nations and ratified rapidly by all nations. Yet 30 years later, and after 27 annual United Nations climate conferences, carbon dioxide emissions and atmospheric concentrations are increasing as fast as ever. The last 2 and 3 United Nations climate conferences ended up again in abject failure. The media put a nice face on the last one, which was the one in Egypt, saying that there'd been a breakthrough on loss and damage, but reported again that was absolutely no progress on climate change mitigation, on reducing emissions. And I want to repeat that the most important fact of all the climate change science ever is the fact that was published by the IPCC, which stated that global greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 and methane, had to be put into decline on an immediate basis and then decline rapidly. Well, we've known since the 2018 IPCC 1.5C report that emissions have to be cut about 50% from 2020 to 2030. And so you can see that these further increase in fossil fuel CO2 emissions is truly a death sentence for our future, humanity, the human race, and also for most of life. Because atmospheric greenhouse gas pollution, global heating of the oceans, global warming, also acidification of the oceans, deoxygenation of the oceans, vast wildfires, forest fires. By the way, I should point out that a report has just been published that the largest forest on Earth, the forest was by far holding the most carbon, had record fires last year with also record CO2 emissions. And that's, of course, a feedback emission because these are the forests in the subarctic, the massive, vast boreal forests, and with drying and increase in temperature, they are burning, these are wildfires, burning more and more, and they're covering vast, vast areas in the boreal. So I was saying that the prospects for an agreement are growing dim year by year, as each year the United Nations has another climate conference, and there is no agreement on putting emissions into decline, which is absolutely necessary for our survival and stated by the IPCC, also stated, in fact, by the chair of the IPCC, Dr. Hassan Lee, at each of these United Nations climate conferences at the opening. But despite that, the governments, the nations reached no agreement and stopping the increase of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly, of course, carbon dioxide, which I'm talking to you about. Reluctantly, one has to look at this war, and the conclusion is very clear. There's absolutely zero chance of anything being done on the global climate emergency so long as this war is being carried on and waged. It is absolutely impossible for anything good to happen out of this war at all. And the worst thing that's coming out of it is completely blocking, ensuring that there is no change in global greenhouse gas emissions, and the CO2 emissions, which I've just said have reached a record high, and so are now on another increasing trajectory. And that is burning up and destroying our future. It is an absolute calamity. It is exasperating to see that there's no movement, no desire apparently, for stopping this terrible war in Ukraine. All that one hears is that the war will stop supposedly when the Russian forces and occupations leave. Also, we're told it'll stop when Ukraine wins the war, and that means it's going to go on and on and on. The war is being rapidly escalated, so the war is getting rapidly worse and worse and worse. And as this war gets worse, our future prospects for survival, no less, become worse and worse and worse. Decades ago, I came to the realization when I was doing nuclear disarmament and peace work and stopping the nuclear arms race, I came to the conclusion that there really is no sense to war at all. It's an absolute insanity. It's a group insanity, and it's insanity that breeds more insanity. And so to me, clearly, this Ukraine situation is absolutely insane. I mean, there's no benefit or rationale whatsoever for this war. And so again, I want to put out my little desperate pleading to look upon this war not as a war that's got to be won by one side or another, but as a war that must stop, which means there must be negotiations, and the negotiations must be directed at a ceasefire and then a peace process. It seems to be absolutely so obvious that this has to happen. This has to be suggested, promoted, and worked at by everybody, by certainly by all governments, but all world citizens as well, because we have no interest in this war whatsoever, except the interest in our future survival, which depends on putting global greenhouse gas emissions into immediate and rapid decline. That can only happen in a world without war, a world of peace, where governments are willing to cooperate for the benefit of all humankind and all life on this planet. I feel apologetic that the news that I bring is so hard to take, painful in the extreme, but this is the world which we find ourselves living in now. And I do want to mention one last thing, and that is the link between the suicidal link between war, this particular war, and greenhouse gas emissions, these increasing fossil fuel CO2 emissions. I don't believe that's the only link, because for many, many years I've come to the conclusion again that we actually live under a constant wartime economy. The Second World War that ended by the World War ended by the Hitler Nazi atrocious regime being beaten by the Allied forces. But as many veterans have told me over the years, we didn't win the peace. President Eisenhower warned us in his famous speech that the big danger was this military-industrial complex, which had been ramped up to enormous, unbelievable levels, particularly by the United States, would continue to hold and would exert power over the United States government and citizenry. And really, I believe this has happened. It's a constant economy, international economy of conflict. It's been called competitiveness. But we have discovered from this Ukraine war that all countries, all these nations and governments have huge supplies of these awful modern weapons of mass destruction, which are getting worse and worse and worse with more and more and more killing power. Um, the United States, of course, is the worst and the prime example. The world military expenditure has reached over $2 trillion a year for the first time. And the United States defense so-called budget, so-called defense, has topped $800 billion this year. It's over, I think it's $850 billion in a year. That is absolutely insane. So we need to, all citizens need, the peace movement needs to get going, get activated. Beautiful country of Ukraine is being absolutely demolished. So if there's one obvious, dramatic, visual reason for working towards peace and disarmament, negotiation, it's what we're seeing happen to Ukraine and happen to those people, thousands of people that are being killed on the bombing of the cities and towns, that are losing their life in this horrid war being waged in the center of Europe, in Ukraine. I just want to finish off with my sort of little saying that if you look at wars and you look at this war, There are no victors in wars. There's no benefit from wars, only destruction and victims. No victors, only victims.